Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are doing our summer series and we are diving into LifeWise. This week, we are concentrating on the agenda. And when we say the agenda, we mean both that of LifeWise itself and of the overarching agenda that we believe LifeWise is ushering forward at a quicker pace than would be without them. Let's put it that way. Zach, did you want to get us started?
Yeah, so on top of the agenda, it's going to be kind of partially a little history lesson here because it's kind of important context, we believe, to understand how religion and education have always kind of been as intertwined as they are. So the first real law about religion in America was the Massachusetts Law of 1642 and then 1647. The Law of 1647 is known as the Old Deluder Satan Act. Um, And what it did was it shifted the responsibility of education to the community from the parents, which is what the law of 1642 initially did. It put the responsibility of education on the parents, and that was actually the first education law followed by this one. The Puritans associated ignorance with Satan's influence, and you can see that in the first line of this law, where it says, being one chief project of that old deluder Satan, where the name comes from, to keep man from the knowledge of the scriptures. So they were specifically inclined to make sure that, the young generation and the kids of the new world would be able to read and write so that they could understand scriptures and the law as well as scriptures. Those are their two primary focuses and reasonings for wanting all of their children to be able to read and write was so that they could read the scriptures and also be a law-abiding citizen, involved in the political nature of the new world. The Connecticut and New Haven colonies followed the Massachusetts model of the required religious instruction in the quote public schools. Virginia, they actually passed laws that threatened parents with fines if they didn't send their children for religious instruction to local church officials. And then in 1683, Pennsylvania's law required parents to instruct their children to read and write again so that they may be able to read the scriptures and write by the time they got to 12. This law in Pennsylvania was part of William Penn's broader governance vision known as the Holy Experiment. And the law established the first school in Pennsylvania and teacher in Philly, and it marked the beginning of formal education in the colony. And it also focused on arithmetic as well as reading and writing. So that was another difference in the Pennsylvania law was that it was, focused on math as well as reading and writing. And kind of the difference in the Pennsylvania law and the earlier Massachusetts law and like the beliefs behind it was not just so that they could learn scripture and get away from Satan's influence of ignorance. They also wanted girls to be able to read, so that kind of expanded it to include females as well. And they wanted to make sure the children also had practical skills beyond just reading the scripture with their education. The New England Primer here, this was the first reading primer designed for the colonies, and it was the foundation of most of the schooling before the 1790s. Before that, it was mainly Bibles brought from England. In the late 1690s, Boston publishers started reprinting what was known as the English Protestant Tutor. They reprinted that under the new name, the England Primer. So the religious indoctrination was still there. This was another document from the Protestants that they kind of reformatted and renamed to be this reading document for these, public educators to use and teach the kids on. Many selections out of this came from the King James Version of the Bible. Some were original. The topics that they discussed in it included parental authority, sin, and salvation, which probably sounds familiar if you're aware of what LifeWise is teaching. It embodied the dominant Puritan attitude and the worldview of the time. And the goal of the education specifically was the inclination and preservation of the Christian faith. Uh, the reading lessons varied in the beginning here. You can see they tied alphabetical letters to like these kind of biblical stories. A is for Adam's fall. Um, I got J for Job, I think, on here. Z for Zacharias. And they just kind of progressed from there. This is obviously the very base elementary school level. and then they kind of evolved from there and got into lessons about the Lord's Prayer, different catechisms, and stories of Puritan martyrs from England. So this was really a widespread document throughout the, original colonies in the early years. So while this doctrine continues to spread with the growing colonies, of course, local communities and other faith groups like the Quakers and started popping up and growing. And during this time, the late 18th century, our founding fathers like Jefferson and Madison were also trying to build a clear wall of separation between church and state with the Constitution and the different amendments, different writings that they had put out and their views. They were also actively advocating for a more formal and publicly funded school system. They were a big part of the push behind that. Another keynote that happens in this part of the timeline that you have to know about is the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Both of these set aside land in the new territories for public schools, and it laid the groundwork for state level support, and it also kind of showed an interest at, not a federal level yet, but it showed interest of the prioritization at this overarching federal level of the whole country needs to be concerned about this and we have to prioritize this, right? Horace Mann, he was a secretary on the Massachusetts Board of Education in the 1800s. He envisioned public schools as a place where children could freely choose their own religious beliefs and kind of wanted to get away from the religious doctrine of it. He was really vilified for this at the time, and even today, he's really kind of viewed as, a bad guy for trying to separate these two things a little bit more than they already were. But he was really pushing for a compromise. He still proposed that you could read the Bible daily in school, but he just couldn't have interpretations of it. He believed that it should be left to the parents and religious leaders to kind of get into the doctrine, to get into the different things that different sects disagree upon. But, we still need this moral foundation that he believed was part of the religious values in the nation. The overarching idea behind the common school movement, aside from this compromise, though, was obviously like universally available, free, and state funded public schools. By the mid 1800s, many states had already adopted the idea of tax supported free public schools and trained teachers and compulsory attendance. This common school movement thrived in a large part because of evangelical Protestants. They kind of got their hands into this and used this system to, quote, further the kingdom of God and assimilate immigrants into a common Protestant culture. Evangelical missionaries, most notably Layman Beecher and Calvin Stowe, helped direct and create this school system throughout the western frontier of the country, using other missionaries to help do so. And I just found this out while I was putting this together. AU just kind of put a thing out about this too that I didn't know about. So, the narrative is kind of that this common school movement with these Protestant undertones was widespread and everywhere. That really wasn't the case. We're just trying to showcase how their hands have always been in it. It wasn't necessarily the way it was everywhere and the only way. In 1844, people rioted. Where was it at? In Philadelphia, I believe. Conflict erupted between Catholics and Protestants. The militia ended up having to come in because they were burning churches, and several people died because there was such a big argument about which version of the Bible should be taught in schools between the Catholics and the Protestants. Uh, so, in addition to the Bible kind of being the basis up until this point, and then the New England Primer, McGuffrey Reader Series was also widely adopted as an ideal textbook, selling an estimated 122 million copies from 1836 to 1920. It aimed to instill a common morality and faith in children based on what was viewed as the nation's religious values, much like its predecessor, the Primer, did. But it related more to the modern Protestant values and doctrine. So it was just kind of, an updated version with different values and different beliefs in the basis, right? So they were kind of trying to get away from the religious overtones, right? It was a little more subtle in this. They gave stories about the good natured boy who must take care of his dog until until he dies. Like he has this responsibility to be a good person and to take care of his commitments and that type of thing. So over the next century, the common public school movement saw many issues while under the control of the states. Nope, wrong slide, my bad. I'm doing way more reading on this because I don't just inherently know it like I do the other stuff. So I do apologize. It just seems like I'm reading a lot compared to some of the other ones. All right, so we're going to enter the federal government. This was something I just learned today as well. I didn't know we had a Department of Education this far back. The original Department of Education was created in 1867 under Andrew Johnson. It was proposed by James Garfield, an Ohio representative at the time. Uh, Johnson only signed the bill despite his hesitations because he believed the department would be mainly symbolic and have little power. It was largely pushed and supported by abolitionists and this crazy Reconstructionist idea that, we need to educate formerly enslaved people. A year after its creation, the department was demoted to being an under office in the Department of the Interior, and it was rapidly dissolved because of the opposition rooted in, quote, states' rights and overreaching federal government, right? So it's really the same arguments that we're hearing today. There's a reason for that. You can draw a direct line to the people fighting this, the reasons they're fighting it from then until now. So over the next century, this common school, public school movement just continued to spread along with the growth of the country. But like I said, with it, many issues came about under the state control and the state direction. We saw more private and parochial schools popping up because of the differences in religion and because parents did desire, to have their kids be educated in the beliefs and traditions of their own faiths. Of course, aside from the religious distinctions that we're talking about, there was also huge issues with race, segregation. We could talk about the Native Americans, we could talk about the former slaves, even the Irish when they start coming in the mid 1800s. They come in with their own beliefs, their own cultures, and their own traditions, and this is really all just not meshing together the way the Protestants had hoped it would when they were kind of pushing this common school goal, right? So we're going to fast forward to the 20th century here. Everson versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court upheld the New Jersey law allowing state funds to be spent reimbursing parents for transportation costs for student attending private religious schools. This was one of the big key court cases, that we saw at this point, kind of regarding, public education, funding, religion, all of that kind of mixed together in this first court case here. And then, of course, the segregation issues all erupted to a head in 1954 when the Supreme Court declared segregated public schools were unconstitutional. And these two cases really marked a significant uptick in the federal government's financial and regulatory involvement in the public schools and the education of the children of this country. The National Defense Education Act marked a substantial increase in federal funding for education because of Sputnik, which I found pretty interesting. They were worried that the Russians were getting ahead of us, so they really wanted to focus on math and science and foreign languages because of, the Cold War type stuff. And then in 65, Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty, he also saw how important education was. So that put in federal regulations regarding funding and serving low income families and making sure that everybody truly had access to this public education, right? And then fast forward till finally the Department of Education was established in 79-80 as its own agency by Carter, consolidating various federal education initiatives. Molly,
So
tell us about these guys.
sure, absolutely. So as you can see, in that last slide, very slowly but surely things start to look like they're going to improve, right? There's starting to be some things put in place, some protections. And then boom, 1979, here comes Jerry Falwell Sr. He is a Baptist minister and a televangelist. and he is going to he's the founder of the Moral Majority, which was an American political organization and movement associated with the Christian right and the Republican Party in the United States. So they're working at both the state and the national levels, and they sought to mobilize evangelical Christians into a potent political force to reverse what it saw as a moral decline. And that moral decline that they're talking about is Zach was just talking about, sort of when we started to come about, some more liberal ideas culturally. So, moral decline that they're describing includes the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the gay rights movement, and the teaching of evolution. So these are the sort of things that they that they are viewing as the moral decline of our nation, and so they are seeking to sort of put a stop to that, to help what they think is a problem. They were opposed to things like the U.S. Supreme Court rulings that banned institutionally initiated group prayer and Bible reading in our public schools. And they were also opposed to the legal right to abortion, so Roe versus Wade, obviously. And what this organization managed to do was energize the religious right, and it quickly grew to several million members. These members were not just Protestants, they were not just evangelicals. It was also Catholics, Mormons, and Jews were also included. And a lot of people opposed them being included, but they still were. So that's just something to keep in mind. The moral majority is actively preying on people's, perceived values and morals, right? So they're saying that this is the correct way to be. If you're a good person, then you would want to be a part of the moral majority. So that way they can sort of shape how things are going to go politics wise in our country. The activities that they include doing were things like voter registration, lobbying, fundraising, and it was almost their impact. I mean, look, you can say it's a decade, right? And their impact on our country was almost immediate. They are almost single-handedly credited with getting Ronald Reagan put into office. And so this is definitely sort of the start of something huge. Uh, in 1987, Falwell, this is him down here, and he's also the one that is shaking hands with Reagan. In 87, he resigned as president, and 87 is around the time that there was a bunch of evangelicals that were embroiled in a lot of scandals and things like that, and they saw their donations start to dwindle. So that was that was an issue, not to mention that they had some internal struggles because Falwell had backed George H.W. Bush, and everyone else in the movement were backing Pat Robertson because he was another televangelist. And that was in the 1988 presidential campaign. So things started to get shaky around that time. And in 1989, the moral majority itself was dissolved, which you're thinking, great, right? It didn't last very long. It was only a decade. Here's the unfortunate part. It was such it was so powerful of a movement. It was so powerful of a um, political strategy, really, that they are credited with making America's fundamentalist churches the grassroots infrastructure of the political right. They are they have made white Protestant fundamentalism has been thoroughly politicized, and the moral majority laid the groundwork for the Christian right in America. So this is literally the playbook in the beginning of what we're seeing now and what we would refer to as the Christian right or the religious right. Now we'll talk about that. Basically, so this is, a political cultural movement. It seeks, sorry, to shape our US laws, policies, public life, all of that according to conservative Christian values. It is not a single organization, but rather a network. Um, all kinds of people, individuals, churches, advocacy groups, political leaders, these sort of people. They all pretty much share the same ideological agenda, and they want laws that reflect the conservative Christian interpretations of morality, right? And just those interpretations. They are primarily evangelical and fundamentalist Protestants. They champion the traditional family structure, idealize a patriarchal, heterosexual, nuclear family model, often oppose feminism, divorce rights, and gender issues. Some of the things that they're known for using to strengthen their side or their reach is using churches as organizing hubs, curriculum reform. And when we say curriculum, we're talking about in our public schools, judicial activism, so appointing judges that are aligned with their conservative values, voter mobilization, again, turning religious people into voters, right? That's their specialty. Convincing them that it is not just their American responsibility to go and vote, but also their God-given and Christian one to do so as well, in order to make our laws fit to their view of our world and how it should be. Influencing school boards, they've been known to do that, of course, and then partnering with legal organizations. And the Christian right has roots that go back even further than the moral majority. Let's be clear there. So this is like 1930s, 1940s. Neo-evangelical leaders are forging ties with business conservatives, and they're building media and campus networks that mixed Christian piety, free market economics, and anti-communism. So this is like an idea that had already been planted, right? Moral majority brings it to the head in the 80s. And then we sort of see again some things that we would consider to be wins, but they would consider to be the moral downfall of society, like banning school-sponsored prayer in 1962 and Bible readings in 1963, and then of course Roe versus Wade. And then that had many Protestants and Catholics just convinced that they needed to do something in order to stop the moral decline of our nation. So the successor groups of the Christian right and of the moral majority are Focus on the Family, Family Research Council, Christian Coalition, Alliance Defending Freedom, American Family Association, etc. All of these organizations, you've probably heard of one or two, maybe all of them, they have all kept this infrastructure alive since the moral majority has disbanded. And their core agenda for a long time was promoting school prayer and in curriculum, opposing abortions, pornography bans, and LGBTQ rights, ending those rights, of course. Let's see. So really what you need to know is that it's the 1970s. Since the 1970s, they've transformed into what was like a fringe movement into a multi-faith conservative coalition. And they have huge influence in US electoral politics and cultural debates. So it's something that is it's not necessarily even something we could keep an eye on, because it's not a specific church, it's not a specific denomination, it is all of them. This is the overarching idea, right? And this is what we would call those people, is the Christian right or the religious right. That being said, if the people are the Christian right, then their beliefs are in Christian supremacy, which refers to both the belief that Christianity is superior to other religions, and a form of identity politics that asserts that Christians are superior to others and are therefore better suited to rule. That is the idea behind Christian supremacy. It overlaps with Christian nationalism. It could be considered a core tenet of Christian nationalism. And a lot of times, Christian supremacy often intersects with other forms of supremacy, such as white supremacy. And as a result, various white Christian supremacist groups exist, such as the Ku Klux Klan, of course, and one that's called Christian Identity. Just thought this was interesting, but Christian identity or identity Christianity is an interpretation of Christianity which advocates the belief that only Celtic and Germanic peoples, such as the Anglo-Saxon Nordic nations or the Aryan race, and kindred peoples are the descendants of the ancient Israelites and are therefore God's chosen people. So that is really concerning. um, Christian nationalism itself is linking that religion and that Christian supremacy to your national identity. And that, that would be how those things all fit together. That being said, places like LifeWise Academy, evangelicals, a lot of the people that we've been talking about, what they're wanting is they're wanting our society and our culture to be shaped to a Christian worldview, aka a biblical worldview. This has been called a defining marker of American evangelical culture. It is something that was born and bred here and has been pushed here. This idea that the world belongs to Christians, they are the chosen ones, and therefore they should be at all levels and in all areas the leaders of those things, you know, so whether it be government or schools or what have you, that is above all else. And as you can see, this bottom part, cultivating a biblical worldview, that is actually taken directly from the LifeWise Teacher Handbook, LifeWise Academy Teacher Handbook. I know it's been a while since we talked about them, but that is sort of what we're getting to. And they absolutely share in this ideal. They are absolutely subscribing to Christian supremacy and Christian nationalism. Right here, cultivating a biblical worldview. LifeWise Academy's mission field is the American public school system. They're saying the quiet part out loud. And basically, they're also saying, and as a result, LifeWise students have been exposed to various worldviews. And the part that they're not saying out loud is we want to bring them back to a Christian worldview. And that's, you know, identifying, viewing, and acting in a way where you're looking at everything through the lens of being a Christian, an evangelical Christian specifically. All right, so that kind of intersects into the Seven Mountain Mandate. The Seven Mountain Mandate is a theological political ideology within some segments of charismatic and evangelical Christianity. Um, those are sort of the two types of Christianity that we'd be looking at. And it holds that Christians are divinely mandated to take control of seven key areas of our society. And as you can see them listed in this horrifying graphic, business, government, family, religion, media, education, and entertainment. Sometimes they'll put arts and entertainment together, but those are the seven. And their ultimate goal is to establish Christian dominion over these areas in a preparation for return for Christ. Um, so this sort of movement believes to have been begun around 1975, and Lauren Cunningham, Bill Bright, and Francis Schaeffer are sort of the pastors or the, you know, the religious leaders that have said that this was, you know, divine, a message from God to them. It was about this Seven Mountain Mandate. And again, to take control of our society by taking control of these spheres of influence. They would infiltrate these areas with Christian values, and and by doing that, they would usher in the second coming of Christ. So that is the entire point. As you can see, in January 2024, there's a Denison University survey that found about 41% of American Christians believe in the Seven Mountain Mandate. That's horrifying. That is a large percentage of our Christians here in our country that believe that they should be the head and leaders of all of these things based on just their religious beliefs. And, you know, they did the same sort of study, the same comparison back in March of 2023, and that number was at 30%. So in 1 year, we've seen a jump of 11%. That is where we're headed. That is what you're looking at. They are quietly invading all sorts of denominations of Christianity without people even being aware sometimes. So that is part of the issue. The biblical base for the movement is actually derived from Revelation 17, 1 through 18. And it says, and here is the mind which hath wisdom. The seven heads are seven mountains. The seven areas that the movement believe influence society and that they seek to influence are family, religion. Oh, I'm sorry. And the seven heads are seven mountains is the end of the verse. So again, there's another part, Isaiah 2:2. Now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on top of the mountains. So they're using these verses to justify this like this ideology. And they're using strategic spiritual warfare and sort of um playing on people's fears and also their political ideologies and mixing those in order to fulfill the Seven Mountain Mandate. And again, that is what they need to do in order to establish the kingdom of God on earth. The 10 to 40 and the 4 to 14 windows. These are interesting. This was more so about the 90s that we start to see this come through. And I think it was like in 2003, 2004 that there was sort of a large meeting of all of these evangelical Christians. And there's a famous missionary strategist, and he sort of came up with these things. First would have come the 10 to 40 window, and it is that highlighted blue part that you're seeing. It's basically the area that's purported to have the highest level of socioeconomic challenges, and the least access to the Christian message. So this is where they want to send all their missionaries. If you've heard of a missionary mission, it is probably in one of these areas. And then also, probably, well, no, I would say it's probably one of these areas. If you've heard of a missionary movement or a large missionary movement, it's going to be probably one of these areas. And what they're doing, I mean, this is colonialism, right? This is sending missionaries over to gatekeep supplies or food or water or whatever it is, in order to spread this message to be missionaries of the gospel. And so they targeted that area. And then again, the same strategist came up with another way to sort of target where they were losing church members, of how to sort of gain back these church members, not only just to target these people in the 10 to 40 window, but even here at home. A huge group that they were missing out on was children ages 4 to 14. They did sort of a few studies. In those studies, what they interpreted to come of those is that between the ages of 4 and 14, you're most likely to absorb fully this message of dominionism, this message of evangelical Christianity, and to never let go of that, to carry that with you throughout the rest of your life and pass that on to your children, et cetera, et cetera. And so not only are you more likely to absorb that yourself between those ages, but those ages are also when you are most likely to proselytize to your peers. Anytime after, obviously, or anytime before 4 is going to be hard, obviously, and anytime after 14, they see a sharp decline in where children would be willing to talk to one another about their faith and about their religious beliefs. And so they're targeting those children in that window. I don't know if you remember, I'm an elder millennial. We had the whole big thing push of what would Jesus do bracelets and youth groups and youth rock concerts and Christian rock and all that was sort of from this 4 to 14 window. And they've not stopped targeting that group, obviously. When we talk about LifeWise Academy being in our K through 12 schools, and being in our elementary specifically, what ages are in our elementary schools? 4 to 14. So that's just a good illustration there that they are continuing this predatory behavior in these two areas.
And it doesn't take a study to know that those are the most impressionable years. Anybody who has had kids or raised kids or been around kids knows that, this is the most impressionable time in their lives before they're fully figuring out who they are and who they're going to be as they enter into adolescence and adulthood.
That's why, in a normal parenting circumstances, you hear a lot of fostering independent thinking, fostering critical thinking, fostering independence, these sort of things. Those are between the ages of 4 and 14, because again, you want your children to retain that. They're doing the opposite by preying on them and indoctrinating them in those ages. This one is a scary one. So the New Apostolic Reformation, also known as Dominionism, I'm not going to read all of these, but they are all the same thing, and they go by different names, and it is on purpose. This is a strategic theological movement rather than just one organization. It is not governed by any official denomination, and it is led by alleged apostles and prophets, right? There's a lot of mysticism going on with these guys. They combine elements of Pentecostalism, evangelicalism, and the Seven Mountain Mandate. The Seven Mountain Mandate is considered a core doctrine of the NAR, but they combined all of those and advocate for spiritual warfare. So these are the people that you're seeing assigning like that the left are demons, or that the devil is taking over society and we have to reclaim him and bring our country back to its original values, these sort of things. That is where some of this is coming from, again with the purpose to bring about Christian dominion over all aspects of society, and end or weaken the separation of church and state. I mean, that is an absolute goal of theirs. This term, it was first coined in a book by C. Peter Wagner, as you can see at the bottom there. And then over here, this graphic, this is kind of an older graphic, but it just gives you kind of an idea. And I got it from this link down here. This is an interesting website, and it is almost a collection of it's the research body and collection of someone who has been tracking members of the NRA for years. And it was very useful. And so if you have questions or you're concerned, you think your pastor or your leader might be part of the group, go and visit that, type that name in. There's a lot more information available there, but you can see some of their organizations that they're sort of associated with down at the bottom: Morning Star Ministries, International Coalition of Apostles, Revival Alliance. If you aren't familiar with these, that means you're not part of their world, but where they're from, this is big business, this is big stuff. And um again, they're not going by one name on purpose. So they're sending out these apostles and these prophets. And what we're finding is that there may be innocent churches, members of churches, who are falling for this sort of thing and this sort of doctrine, without even knowing that they're being part of it, that they're being made part of it. So that is something that I specifically find very concerning. Let's see, give me just 1 second. I want to make sure I didn't miss anything on this one.
Did that NAR Connections website come from like the Lancaster Examiner? Because that's another good resource that I know that's on top of this.
Yep.
Is that who it came from? I was just wondering.
I don't think it is, but I did see that, and that is an absolutely great resource.
Yeah.
Um, Let me see here just a second, guys. I apologize. Like Zach said, this is a lot of information. All right, so just a few more things. The NAR has been dubbed as one of the most important Christian religious and political movements of our time. And that was not of a proponent of theirs. So please know that this group is very dangerous. Um, the most radical change in the way of doing church since the Protestant Reformation. That's their words. And again, just a few other parts for them. They're part of the charismatic Christian movement, which we talked about. Um, there's a book from 2002. That's where C. Peter Wagner first termed the coin the New Apostolic Reformation. Um, and the movement believes in the institutional church has caused the loss of apostolic office and therefore the full power available to Christendom. So their goal is to reestablish a global apostolic and prophetic governance of the church. And so again, it says because they don't usually go by the NAR name, many sincere Christians are unaware of their participation in it. And it's linked with things like the Kansas City Prophets. Um, let's see, it also claims the direct revelation from God, and many allege that Jesus and angels visit them in person. This is the prophet, people that are talking, calling themselves prophetesses, saying they have visions. This is sort of that territory. Um, they experience oriented theology, and it's based in emotionalism steeped in mysticism, right? So this is not based in doctrine, this is based in experience. That's one of the big difference between these people and what you would normally consider like a fundamentalist Christian or an evangelical. It's only gotten worse since the 2016 election of Donald Trump. And this quote really quick, it says that theology professor, author of 2024 book on the movement, Andre Gagne, characterized it as inherently political and said it threatens to subvert democracy. The Southern Poverty Law Center characterizes NAR as the greatest threat to American democracy that most people have never heard of. So this is the hardcore of the hardest core. Anyone who's subscribing to the NAR. Um, and that's just something to keep in mind. Those of you that are into, I think it was maybe Netflix, I don't remember, Zach, you might know, but there's a 2006 documentary called Jesus Camp. And that documentary actually is from a neo-charismatic summer camp closely associated with the NAR. So if anybody has any familiarity with that, that's what's going on. Now we'll get to the Black Robe Regiment. The term Black Robe Regiment has been revived in recent decades by Christian nationalists. Okay, so originally it would have been taken from phrases such as Black Regiment or Black Robe Brigade, which was occasionally used by British loyalists during the American Revolution. And it's not referring to a fighting force of Protestant clergy, but they were a clergy force that sort of just preached in a way to rally the populace to take up arms against the crown, right? So these are preachers who are mixing their religion with the revolutionary idea of freedom. That's where the term Black Robe Regiment comes from. Again, it's been co-opted by Christian nationalists as of late, and conservative political movements, namely Glenn Beck in the Tea Party, if you remember that. He popularized the term, and basically it made it so that it means within all circles, basically, is a religious leader who supports conservative causes. Christian nationalism is basically the modern is their modern doctrine for the Black Robe Regiment, and implies a divine endorsement for political activism, especially against perceived secularism. So abortion rights, LGBTQ rights, trans rights, church state separations, these are all things that the Black Robe Regiment are going to rail against. Um, Critics argue that the modern use of the term distorts the history, right? Because the history of it isn't necessarily something bad. It's people that are faithful using their faith to inspire the soldiers, right? That's not inherently a bad thing. But again, because it's been co-opted by Christian nationalists, because it's taken on a whole different meaning, it is absolutely, driving us towards a theocracy. That is their purpose. And there's a lot of people involved. There is no set membership list that you can search or look up. Basically, what it consists of is like your pastor, let's say, for example, would go and would submit his information and his name and his church's name that he would want to be a part of the Black Robe Regiment. And then you would have to become a member in order to get access to contact any other member, is sort of how they're making that work. But we do have some documentation. So there was Glenn Beck sort of did like he had all these people come and sort of talk during a rally in 2010, and there ended up being like 240 pastors up on the stage. And a lot of those pastors are, ones that we've heard of, like Jerry Falwell Jr., which is the son of Jerry Falwell Sr., of course. Richard Lee, might have heard of him, Harry Jackson. So these are people that are like, or Jim Garlow, these are people that are big up in these huge evangelical Christian mega churches, right? They carry a lot of power, they have a lot of money, and they have a lot of political pull. And they're all part of this. Interestingly enough, who else is part of the Black Robe Regiment? Steve Hubbard. He is also a reverend. He is on the LifeWise board of directors. He is been known for a long time to be associated with this. This was back from, I think, like 2010 that he spoke to, no, the Black Robe Regiment, I'm sorry, he spoke, this was like back in 2020, but even before that he was associated with the Tea Party. um and so and patriots and things of this nature. So basically they say that if you want to identify, and this is based on my research, you're welcome to go and conduct your own, but based on my research, one of the best ways to identify a pastor or a clergy member who is associated with the Black Robe Regiment is if they've ever given a talk on the Black Robe Regiment. So it's my assumption that Reverend Hubbard, Pastor Hubbard here, is really deep in with the Black Robe Regiment and their crew. There's a picture of Glenn Beck, as you can see, and that's the talk where he first would have featured a lot of those pastors and sort of was driving home this idea of uniting our clergy under a political umbrella, a conservative political umbrella, to further their Christian nationalist agenda.
He looks rough without the studio makeup.
Yeah, he does. I thought that too.
All right. So, with all of this decisive and intentional push to bring this worldview into the forefront of politics and culture, it's led to many different court cases, legislative agendas, and issues which typically end in opaque decisions and inherent confusion, and while slowly chipping away the wall of separation that our forefathers worked so hard to build. Like Molly said, the catalyst for a lot of this stuff was the 1962 case of Engel versus Vitale, when the Supreme Court ruled that state officials could not require students to recite a particular prayer each day in public schools. Reagent prayer. I'm gonna have to look that up. I don't have it here. It was a certain prayer with a specific name. I don't have it here in my notes though. A year later, the other big case was Abington versus Shemp, and that was when the court declared the daily Bible readings in public schools were unconstitutional in 1963. So
So
this was
not
something else. Go ahead.
I was going to say, not to interrupt you, Zach, but just make note of that. I mean, we're talking about these are two court cases that really started this entire explosion of controversy, and the Christian right versus anyone that was a proponent of separation of church and state and secular public school. These were just about 1962 and 63. Zach, you said it was about the praying. It was a prayer that they said every day where they were like
Mhm.
saying that's unconstitutional. And then the other one was what?
The daily Bible reading.
Daily Bible. So if in 1962 and 63, they are making this illegal now at this point, and it causes such an eruption of controversy, I want you to think about how many schools and kids and teachers and communities have been doing those things and for how long.
Right. And that's
Even
actually, I
though,
was just going to get into.
even though it is expressed and they knew that it was wrong for decades. Go ahead, Zach. Sorry. I just need
So,
to
like I said, Americans United just put this article out yesterday, so it was really good timing. But apparently, in 1960, 2 or 3 years before these cases, Americans United undertook a survey of the states and found that only 5 of the states had laws on the books requiring daily Bible reading, and 25 states allowed optional school-sponsored Bible reading. Courts in 11 states had declared this practice unconstitutional. So it wasn't everywhere, but like Molly's saying, it is still a lot of communities. It is still widespread. Again, the Christian national narrative is that we've always had prayer in schools, we've always had Bible in schools. Well, no, because even in 1960, before these federal cases, 11 states had said it was unconstitutional. So it was widespread and it was a problem, but it wasn't the norm, right? So after these cases, it is just a litany of different attacks and different pieces of legislation trying to overturn this. For decades, advocates of school prayer worked tirelessly to overturn these decisions with proposed constitutional amendments regarding school prayer. In 1966 and in 71, they tried to get constitutional amendments passed. And then in 1979, the Senate actually adopted a proposed bill which would bar the Supreme Court from reviewing any state law related to voluntary prayer in public schools. Thankfully, that was stopped in the House of Representatives. And then this back and forth just continues to go on into the 80s. Reagan again proposed a constitutional amendment trying to get prayer allowed in school. And then this brings us to the Equal Access Act of 84, which ensured non-curriculum student groups is key here, could meet to discuss religious, political, and philosophical viewpoints without discrimination. This was upheld and affirmed by the Supreme Court in 1990 in Board of Education of West Side Community Schools versus Mergens in regard to student organized religious organizations, which again is a really important distinction that has to be made. This isn't just any religious organization can come in and use the schools. This is student-led religious organizations can come, student-organized religious organizations, which LifeWise is not, even though they are trying to cite these equal access claims nowadays. Fast forward to Lee in 1992. Again, the issue of prayer in school came to the Supreme Court here in this case. This was regarding prayer during a high school graduation and addressed the inherent coercion of prayer. Even if students weren't forced to, it was still coercive to have it in this official school capacity during this official school event, having one particular clergy member come in. I believe it was a Jewish leader that came in and led the prayer, if I'm not mistaken. In 1993, we looked at the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which actually passed, and that prohibited the government from substantially burdening a person's religious exercise. But 4 years later, the Supreme Court ruled it was unconstitutional when it was applied to state and local governments. so it limited its application to federal laws. I didn't have enough time to dig into why it would not apply at one level and would apply at another level. I would like to, but I didn't have time to do that in my research today. Uh, in 1997, in defiance of some of these court orders, school officials in Alabama pushed and approved measures not only protecting but enabling student-led prayer in class at assemblies, over the intercom, and at football games. And as you can see in this article here, they are still pushing the same agenda and, in fact, mandates in 2025. Uh, then in 98, there was another big push for a quote religious freedom amendment, which aimed to secure the right to acknowledge God and practice religious beliefs on public property. But like all the attempts before it, it also failed to pass. That brings us to Kennedy. We're gonna fast forward here. We're gonna fast forward here to the 2020s. And that brings us to the Kennedy case, which really kind of overturned all of this precedent that the courts have upheld and established before this, right? This was a highly debated case, and it gained national attention when the Supreme Court said that what they did was they protected a coach who was praying on the football field during a game with all of his players there, right? Even though this was school official led at a school event, they still said it was his personal right to do this, and there wasn't coercion there, even though there was clearly coercion there, right? And we are still dealing with these exact same issues that we have been dealing with. That's the point we're getting to here. We can look at the Saint Isidore case, the Supreme Court just ruled on, the Ten Commandments case out of Louisiana, which the courts just ruled on. They said that Louisiana could not require these Ten Commandments to be held or to be posted in the schoolroom, but that's not stopping other states from trying to pass the exact same legislation, right? We see Ohio trying to do it. We see Texas trying to do it. Even though the Supreme Court has said it couldn't be done the way it was done in Louisiana, other states are trying to do it, trying to find a way that they can do it. So it's not stopping. The push is just going to continue to happen because it is so organized, it is so deliberate, and it is so intentional. So why this focus on schools? This quote, I think, sums it up perfectly. We've given you all the history here of how far back the church's involvement goes. Established churches gave up an important aspect of their power, the power to control public education. Why was this power so important? Many in the churches firmly believed that the power over education was the power to shape the religious and moral values of future generations. Without this power to educate from a biblical viewpoint, many religious leaders would argue not only were the foundations of the church at risk, but so were the moral foundations of the state. This is why education is such a big deal to these religious groups, to these political groups. Which brings us to LifeWise. They are truly just an arm of this. And, on one sense, they're a small arm on it, but on another sense, they are broad strokes of this smaller arm. Their vision statement is very clear. They want to reach unchurched students. They aren't just trying to pass the gospel along or provide an education to those who already believe this. They want to reach unchurched students. This is about conversion. Another one of their goals is dissolving the separation. I'm sorry, they say solving the separation of church and state, but let's be honest, it is dissolving it. This is what they want to do. They want to reinstall religious education into the public school day, as you can see by their book here. This is Joel Penton's book, and it really just lays out the entire plan and why they think it is important. And it's just kind of all the stuff that we talked about. They believe the narrative is religion has always been in schools and it needs to continue to be in schools so that their worldview can dominate, so that they can convert these kids into the belief system that they hold. Why is this so important? Because, as Molly mentioned earlier, the numbers are going down. There are so many less individuals identifying themselves as Christian over the past years. These studies come from 2020. Young Americans are now less likely to remain Christian and are more likely to remain unaffiliated. 1 in 6 teenage children of Christian mothers do not share their faith. And the decline of Christianity overall may have stopped, but it is starting to go back up because this push is working, as you can see, but they're still less likely to identify as Christians. That is why the focus is so much on these younger students. Like Molly said earlier, this all goes back to that 4 to 14 window. They want to get them when they're young so that they can hold this viewpoint throughout their life and thus stop the decline, right? This is kind of the overarching view. Molly, you want to talk about this a little bit?
Yeah, I was gonna say this is sort of this is taken from LifeWise's, is it their 2023 like end of year recap. Basically what they're doing is they're laying out their plans, and that they would essentially like to reach 13,000 districts, 90,000 schools, and 50 million students. And they're laying out what they would need to do that. And, we're not going to go through all of them here, but the very end one is at the maximum projected impact that 10% of schools nationwide would have LifeWise, by 2030, 10%, and then over 90% within 35 years. So their goal is an absolute takeover. They want to be disrupting and dividing children in every school, in every district, in every city of our whole country. And they lay out what they would need to do that, and that the investment they would need in order to make that happen is $100 million. You see down here where Joel Pitton himself actually says, when he's asked, what are some of your goals? And he says, we don't want to stop until every one of the 50 million public school children have been reached by the gospel. They break down what their smaller goals were, but overall, and that's what their end game is.
They want all the children to be indoctrinated into this belief system.
Yep.
And a big part of how they're going to do that, which of course we've touched on earlier in some of our other segments here, is by changing legislation, right? And this all ties back into how this is so politically intertwined. They're trying to push legislation all across the country, and hopefully, in their hope, at the federal level. They are absolutely trying to get some of the stuff they're pushing forward challenged and into a federal court and overturn the precedent regarding RTRI as we've had in this country in the past. So I'm not going to get into this because we have gone onto it so much in other presentations, but just know this is a huge part of their, short-term and long-term goals both. And again, how are they tied to the religious right? We've gone into this a bunch as well, so we're not going to go too far into it here, but it is all of these extreme right, conservative, religious, political organizations tied into LifeWise here in one way or another, either platforming them, supporting them financially, sponsoring their programs, or being sponsored by them. Anything you want to add here, Molly?
You're going to see a lot of names on here that you recognize because of media coverage, Moms for Liberty, Patriot Mobile, things like that. But some of the ones that maybe you haven't heard of are very frightening as well. And they're of the same creed. They have the same goals, same ideologies. And I mean, this is an incestuous family tree of fascism. And what these people want is to turn our democracy into a theocracy. And they are going to put all of their money and all of their resources behind doing so. We are concentrating on LifeWise Academy because they are affecting our public schools and our public education. But with whatever realm you are in, whatever affects you, your family life, your personal life, if any of these companies are involved, even peripherally, just know that that is the direction that they are going. That is what their wishes are.
And, a lot of these organizations go back to, the movements that Molly talked about earlier, this sort of moral majority, and even before that, the Southern Baptist Convention, they go all the way back to desegregation, because again, this is also very much tied to racism. We've talked a lot about Christian nationalism, but don't for a second think that it doesn't have its roots in desegregation and slavery. Like I said earlier, it's the same arguments that we heard about that states' rights and federal overreach when they're talking about public education were the same arguments they were using to defend slavery, right? And the Southern Baptist Convention split from the largest Baptist convention over that, right? So these are old organizations, some of them. The Wall Builders is obviously, I think, one of the most crazy ones, and they are really pushing this narrative. So they're one to look into if you haven't heard about them as well. So hopefully that was a fun history lesson for you. Hopefully we were not too bad there.
A little terrifying. Thank you for being here. We appreciate it. Taking the time out of your day to join us and learn about the overarching and underlying agenda of LifeWise Academy. If you would like, more than welcome to join our email list. We have a QR code here. Our citations and source materials for the presentation are there as well with that QR. If you have anything that you would like to report or let us know about, we are always available. Contact at seculareducationassociation.org, and that will go directly to Zachariah. We will be happy to get back to you as soon as we can.
Thanks.